The dropship descended slowly through the copper-green atmosphere of Elveron 6, its engine humming with a steady, eerie pulse. Alex Monroe sat silently by the viewing port, watching the jungle world draw closer beneath him. Enormous trees stretched skyward like skeletal fingers, their translucent leaves shimmering with a faint bioluminescent sheen. The canopy looked like it pulsed with life, every movement beneath it betraying a world that had no intention of welcoming strangers. He had read the orientation file twice. Elveron 6 was not only unpredictable, it was known for killing the unprepared. The Zenorian Emergency Training Base had accepted only one human this cycle. Alex hadn't expected the invitation, but when it came, he accepted without hesitation. He had no cybernetic implants, no exosuit enhancers, no neural link visor. What he brought was a battered duffel bag with handwritten notes, a flint striker wrapped in cloth, and a stitched-together survival manual his grandfather had given him before he joined the planetary service. The rest of the cadets came from across the known galaxy, species born in methane seas, sentient clouds, desert burrowers, photosynthetic thinkers. Alex had read about many of them, but seeing them in person stirred something odd in him, a mix of awe and impending isolation. When the hatch hissed open and he stepped onto the platform, the smell hit him first. Thick, wet air saturated with the scent of rotting flowers and minerals. He adjusted his scarf to filter the humidity and walked past his fellow arrivals. A translucent quadruped from Krasari barked in clipped code to a sleek, Caton-armored cadet from the Shrell system. A floating, jelly-like being bobbed silently above the ground, and a feathered humanoid with 4 eyes adjusted his respiration mask while glaring at Alex's bare arms. No one offered a greeting. "Primitive carbon breather," one cadet muttered in a language Alex only partially understood. He smiled and kept walking. He was used to being underestimated. The central orientation hub was a circular building embedded into the cliffside. Smooth metallic panels glowed with embedded lights, and a rotating holographic diagram displayed the base layout overhead. A digital voice welcomed each cadet by species and identification code. When it reached Alex, the voice paused, then stated flatly, "Human, unmodified, Earth sector." Several heads turned, a few eyes widened. One cadet actually laughed. Inside, the instructors, an older species known as the Velari, delivered the mission objectives. Emergency protocols were the backbone of this training. Fire drills, structural collapses, low oxygen survival, and radiation exposure simulations. The cadets would be immersed in each scenario. Assistance would be limited. Protocol required each participant to rely on personal judgment and species-specific knowledge. Alex listened closely while others took casual glances, confident in their superior tools and collective memory implants. After orientation, the cadets were assigned pods, individual living spaces with filtration systems and emergency resource lockers. Alex's pod was farthest from the mess hall and closest to the tree line. He didn't mind. Isolation gave him time to observe. Each night, he walked to the edge of the jungle and made sketches in his notebook, noting patterns in the wind, the timing of bird calls, the way the air cooled suddenly just before midnight. He had no artificial neural assistance. He had his senses and a method passed down through generations. On the 3rd day, drills began. The first test was a basic obstacle course during high gravity. Most alien cadets moved sluggishly, unprepared for the shift. Alex, though sweating heavily, had trained for this. He ducked, climbed, and rolled through the terrain using raw muscle memory. No one acknowledged his results. The second trial involved water purification under time constraints. The Shrell cadet used a mini filtration drone. The Krosari quadruped secreted a glandular enzyme that sterilized the water instantly. Alex crushed berries from the food pack, boiled the mixture, and strained it through heated sand and bark. His process took longer, but the output was pure. Again, no one noticed. But it was the 3rd evening, as cadets gathered in the central mess, that Alex felt the tension. The conversations were in code-switching dialects, full of assumptions that tech would save them in any real crisis. One cadet scoffed at the idea of manual survival. Another sneered, "What will the human do? Rub sticks together and pray for warmth?" That comment earned a few laughs. Alex didn't respond. He just sipped the warm nutrient broth, finished his tray, and returned to his pod. He'd seen it before. overconfidence in devices without understanding their limits. Earth had learned that lesson the hard way. The next morning, a soft chime sounded in every pod. A message blinked on the screen. Live drill combustion response, beginning in 30 standard minutes. The simulation was expected. Every cadet had trained for it. But Alex noticed something odd. The humidity levels were rising unnaturally fast. Outside his pod, the wind felt uneven. Something in the air vibrated too heavily. He glanced at the nearby trees. Several leaves were curling inward prematurely, a sign he remembered from Earth's jungles. He narrowed his eyes. Something was off. He tightened his boots, grabbed his flint, and tucked a sealed pouch of crushed charcoal and mud paste into his belt, just in case. 29 minutes later, the drill began, and nothing would go as planned. The air felt heavier than usual as Alex stepped out of his pod and scanned the skies above the tree canopy. The mist had thickened unnaturally fast. Clouds pulsed with a greenish hue, too opaque for mere humidity. He crouched and touched the soil, warm but not volcanic. He smelled the faint trace of burned resin. The drill was supposed to be a controlled simulation. This wasn't simulation heat. This was real. He straightened and looked toward the command tower, but the glass panels remained dim, without the usual pulsing indicators. The instructors were observing silently, as protocol dictated. No interference would come, not unless there were fatalities. The first alarm blared in low tones across the base, a subsonic frequency designed to reach species without traditional hearing. Red lights strobed in rhythmic intervals. The cadets filed out of their pods, some donning thermal armor or adjusting their filtration masks. A spherical cadet with a transparent membrane rolled past him in a panic, squealing in its native clicks. One of the insectoid Shrell trainees yelled something about a containment leak. Alex didn't panic. He calmly pulled out his scarf and dampened it with water from his canteen, then wrapped it over his mouth and nose. The air was turning acidic. 2 explosions rang out from the eastern quadrant of the jungle. Screeches and flashes of light cut through the mist. Black smoke curled above the canopy, dancing unnaturally against the wind. That wasn't simulated fire. That was chemical combustion. Someone had triggered an unstable oxygen mix or miscalculated a containment unit. Alex stepped away from the base's perimeter and moved downhill, away from the pod structures, closer to the natural clearing he had scouted the previous night. Around him, cadets shouted conflicting instructions in dozens of dialects. The heat-reactive aliens began showing symptoms first. One with scale-like skin collapsed as his body tried to dissipate the rising temperatures. Another aquatic-based cadet staggered as her hydration suit boiled from the inside. Even those with cybernetic assistance faltered as the environment overwhelmed artificial sensors. The floating jelly being tried to rise above the smoke, but tangled in the branches overhead and began to pulse erratically. Alex moved with purpose. He didn't try to lead. He didn't shout. He observed the wind, southwest, shallow gusts, then moved to the side of the clearing where the terrain dipped slightly. That's where airflow would naturally gather. He pulled out a compact digging tool from his belt and began carving into the soil, scooping downward until he formed a narrow trench. Then he started on a second hole, about a foot apart, connected by a thin tunnel. The Dakota fire hole, efficient, contained, nearly smokeless. His fingers moved quickly, scooping and shaping, while above him the canopy groaned from the heat. Another detonation shook the air, this one much closer. The fire had leapt to the base's eastern pod cluster. The smell of melting synthetic alloy stung his nostrils. A scream echoed across the clearing. A cadet from the crystalline race dropped to the ground, her limbs fracturing from thermal shock. Others ran, stumbling blindly, seeking exits that weren't there. Alex didn't look up. He layered the first hole with dried bark, charred leaves, and crushed vine pulp, packed for slow combustion. Then he lined the second hole with wet clay and debris to draw air through the connecting tunnel, feeding the flame below the surface while keeping smoke minimal. Nearby, one of the instructors stood hidden behind a thermal-shielded screen, observing. He didn't speak. His species, the Valari, had always believed in non-intervention. Alex knew this wasn't just training anymore. It was observation of something else, something brutal. The fire was not supposed to spread this far, but no one was stopping it. The wind shifted again. Alex narrowed his eyes and built a stone wall to partially cover the airflow direction. He lit the fire in the first pit with his striker. The flame caught instantly but remained low. Smoke curled downward, then was pulled sideways into the tunnel and funneled upward through the second pit. Almost invisible. Just heat. He smiled slightly. It was working. He looked up and saw a cadet, a four-eyed avian from the Lar species, crawling toward him, coughing violently. Her wings drooped with ash, her mouth open in desperation. He didn't hesitate. He reached forward, pulled her toward the area near his pit, and forced her head down to the ground. The low position gave her access to cleaner, cooler air just above the dirt. She clutched his sleeve and whispered a word he didn't understand. He simply nodded and handed her a damp cloth from his bag. Within minutes, others began appearing. One by one, cadets staggered toward the strange scene. The fire burned low, nearly invisible, but the air around it was stable, smoke-free, warm, but breathable. The alien with translucent skin arrived, half-conscious, and dropped beside the pit, quivering. Alex wordlessly took out a thermal blanket and placed it around his shoulders. Then came a Shrell trainee, limping, holding his thorax. Alex pointed to the area downwind of the fire and motioned for him to lie flat. He obeyed without a word. From behind the trees, a new sound emerged, clicking pulses in rhythmic sequence. A telepathic cadet, previously silent, now stood with his hands outstretched, projecting calm through mental pulses. His species couldn't speak aloud, but he had locked onto Alex's actions and was now transmitting them across the remaining cadets' shared field. Those with telepathic receivers began following instructions. Drop low, cover face, approach from the north side, don't panic. The chain reaction began, not because of authority, but because of action. Alex worked silently, reinforcing the fire pit with side walls made from mud and leaves. He didn't know if it would last more than an hour, but for now it was holding. The heat stayed central. The air stayed clear. The panic around him began to settle. From the shadows, the Valari instructor finally activated his command interface. A soft chime echoed across the clearing, and the fire suppression system in the eastern quadrant began to engage. Drones lifted from their pods and sprayed a neutralizing foam across the last blazing section. The fire shrank, retreating into embers and hissing steam. Alex looked up only when the smoke began to lift. He didn't feel victorious. He felt exhausted. But he knew something had shifted. This had not been a typical drill. It had been a test of essence. Who adapted? Who thought clearly? Who knew what survival really meant when tools failed and instincts had to rise? In that moment, in the heart of that chaos, his fire pit had become more than warmth. It had become a signal, a primitive one, but unmistakably human. The jungle still crackled in the distance, but within the clearing there was an eerie calm. The cadets who had collapsed or panicked were now gathered around the center where Alex's pit radiated heat without threat. The fire had become a nucleus, not only of warmth, but of stability. Alex didn't speak unless it was necessary. He knelt beside one of the cadets whose suit had ruptured and carefully dabbed the burn marks with the antiseptic gel from his kit. The Lar cadet, the one with 4 eyes and scorched wings, winced and hissed, but she held still. She didn't speak either. Her eyes followed every movement he made, as if trying to memorize his hands. Alex's fingers were blackened with soot and mud, his sleeves soaked through with sweat and jungle mist. He moved efficiently, gathering bark, wet leaves, stacking them in layers for insulation, reinforcing the windbreak, and silently repositioning the cadets so that the airflow curved across them without suffocating heat. He had learned this kind of firecraft in the forests of Earth, where silence kept animals at bay and calmness preserved lives. He noticed that one of the cadets, a silicon-skinned being with thin vent ridges along his neck, was shivering in a way that didn't match the external temperature. He had collapsed only moments ago, and now his arms twitched involuntarily. Alex reached for his blanket but hesitated. He had only one left. Before he could decide, the avian cadet, her feathers partially singed, stood, swaying, and draped her own protective wrap around the silicon being. She didn't say anything. She simply returned to her seated position beside the fire pit, eyes scanning the mist like a hawk. Alex gave her a short nod. She nodded back, her 4 eyes blinking in sequence. A new scent drifted in from the north side of the jungle. Pungent, metallic. Alex sniffed the air and stood. He recognized the smell. Fused resin and smoldering rubber. The blaze was attempting a second front, crawling along synthetic vines near the environmental station. If it reached the fuel cells mounted under the terrain, the explosion wouldn't be containable. He turned quickly and surveyed the cadets. None of them were mobile enough to help. Most were still recovering, dehydrated, smoke-sick, or disoriented. But he spotted one possibility. A quadruped cadet with bioluminescent skin was propped up against a stone outcrop. His breathing had stabilized and his posture had returned to partial alertness. Alex approached him and pointed to the northern tree line. "Can you walk?" he asked. The cadet opened one large liquid black eye and blinked slowly. Alex wasn't sure if he understood English, so he knelt and drew a quick diagram in the dirt. Fire, direction, rock pile. Then he mimicked lifting stones. The cadet exhaled a low tone and slowly pulled himself upright. Together they moved up the slope, past the fire pit, and into the thicker mist where the emergency fire was just beginning to lick its way through the underbrush. Alex spotted a collection of lava rocks that had cooled near a fallen log. He motioned for the cadet to help carry them. They worked in silence. The cadet's rear legs slipped occasionally on the damp slope, but he adapted quickly. Alex grabbed longer pieces of bark to create a sliding wall and laid them into the path of the flames, then stacked the stones to create a partial barrier. When the flames tried to spread around it, the shape of the terrain slowed the crawl, long enough for the burning vines to wither on their own. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. When they returned to the clearing, Alex noticed more cadets had begun repositioning themselves. Without instruction, the avian girl had organized two others to begin gathering wet debris from the riverbed just beyond the southern rise. The telepathic cadet, his head faintly glowing, stood like a beacon in the middle of the group, his psychic pulses spreading outward in rhythm. Alex didn't need to understand the language. He could feel the shift in energy. The fear had lessened. The chaos had become purpose. An hour passed, then another. Eventually, a faint shimmer appeared in the air near the clearing's edge. A shimmering sphere unfolded, and from within it stepped a tall figure cloaked in iridescent robes. A Velari instructor, one of the senior observers. His 6 glowing eyes studied the scene silently. He didn't speak. He moved slowly, deliberately, scanning the faces of each cadet. Then he crouched beside the fire pit and examined the structure. He took note of the airflow trench, the heat channel, the base insulation. He didn't react outwardly, but his antennae twitched. Alex remained crouched across the fire watching him. The instructor finally stood and faced the cadets. "This was not part of the approved drill," he said in a voice that echoed unnaturally. "An unstable containment cell triggered a real combustion event. The test parameters were exceeded. You were not meant to survive without intervention. And yet, you did." He turned toward Alex. "Human, your methods are not elegant, your tools are primitive, but your solution was effective." Alex didn't respond with words. He merely stood and dusted the ash from his pants. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the accumulated weight of responsibility. He had not come to lead. He had only come to survive. Yet something had happened that none of the others, in all their technology and training, could achieve. He had turned desperation into discipline. He had turned fear into focus. The Velari instructor lifted a hand. A small orb unfolded and began to scan the area, collecting visual and thermal data. It pulsed once, twice, then rose into the air and disappeared. The instructor nodded once and vanished into the shimmer. Silence returned. The cadets remained seated around the low, glowing pit. The fire burned cleanly now, emitting only a faint column of heat. Alex sat back down beside the quadruped who had helped him with the rocks. He didn't speak, nor did the alien. But a slow, rhythmic hum began to vibrate from the cadet's body. A cultural gesture, perhaps. A sound of respect. Moments later, the avian girl leaned closer and spoke with a raspy tone. Her voice cracked from the smoke. "You built this with your hands?" He nodded. She studied him for a moment, then looked into the pit and whispered, "It feels alive." Alex smiled faintly. "It is." As the shimmer faded and the Velari instructor disappeared, a strange quiet settled over the clearing. It was not the silence of fear or confusion, but the stillness that followed a shift in order, like the hush that comes after a storm when nothing is broken but everything has changed. Alex sat beside the fire, his back against a stone, watching the pit breathe with heat. The flame remained nearly invisible, its energy steady and controlled. Smoke barely whispered from its opening, rising as a faint shimmer against the cooling air. The cadets didn't return to their pods. Most of them remained gathered in a rough semicircle, their eyes trained on the pit or on him. The avian girl had curled her wings protectively around herself and dozed lightly. But one of her eyes remained half open, occasionally darting to where Alex sat. The silicon-skinned cadet slept with his limbs tucked close, humming faintly through his vent ridges. The quadruped, now fully alert, walked a slow perimeter around the group, pausing now and then to listen to the jungle as if guarding the perimeter. Alex didn't speak. He used the time to reinforce the fire structure once more, replacing the top layer with fresh bark and moist leaves to keep the heat low and the airflow balanced. Then he turned his attention to a new task, rationing supplies. He opened his satchel and laid out what little he had left. 2 nutrient bars, a half pouch of powdered broth, 3 dried moss wraps, and a hand-sewn sachet of medicinal herbs. He hadn't brought them expecting this, but it didn't matter. Now that they were needed, he didn't hesitate. He unwrapped the moss and carefully crumbled it into small sections. Then he soaked each portion with a few drops of water from his canteen until it became soft enough to chew. One by one, he distributed the portions to the cadets who were awake and alert enough to consume them. The avian girl accepted hers wordlessly, blinking in acknowledgement. The jelly-like cadet, hovering now just inches above the ground, received a few drops of broth directly into her central membrane, which shimmered brighter after absorption. The telepathic cadet sat slightly apart from the group, head tilted forward. A soft glow pulsed from his temples as he maintained a mental thread across the gathered survivors. Alex didn't know what signals were being exchanged, but he noticed how cadets glanced toward each other at regular intervals. Subtle nods, shared awareness, collective regulation. Even the panicked ones had calmed. He recognized the look in their eyes. They had found something to anchor themselves to. Not words, not hierarchy, just the shape of firelight and the pattern of survival. Suddenly, the sky rumbled with low thunder. The mist above the jungle began to swirl again. Alex stood and looked to the treetops. He didn't see storm clouds. Instead, he spotted the rotating formation of atmospheric dispersal drones, machines deployed to stabilize the training field's climate in case of collapse. Their presence confirmed what he had suspected. The instructors were no longer just watching. The event had escalated far enough to warrant partial intervention, even if none would come directly to the ground. A few minutes later, a second shimmer appeared. Not a Valari, but a medical response unit, unmanned, gliding just above the tree line. It hovered briefly before releasing 6 insect-sized medbots that zipped down toward the clearing. They scanned each cadet in sequence, pausing longer at those with visible wounds. One hovered directly in front of Alex and scanned his burned palms. It emitted a soft beep and moved on. No treatment offered. He wasn't in critical condition. That was fine with him. He wasn't here to be saved. While the bots worked, the quadruped cadet returned from his patrol and settled beside the pit again. His bioluminescent skin pulsed softly in changing shades of green and gold. After a moment, he extended one of his limbs and placed a flat palm gently onto the ground. Alex watched as the limb began to glow. Then the soil around it shifted slightly. From beneath the surface, he extracted 3 tightly packed root bulbs. He passed them to Alex without explanation. Alex examined the roots carefully. They were firm, oily, and dense with moisture. He recognized the type from a briefing on native flora: nutritious, non-toxic, but tough to break down. He nodded in thanks and moved toward the flat stone he had used as a sitting platform earlier. With a smaller rock, he began grinding the bulbs into a paste. It was tedious work, but the result would offer slow-release energy. As he worked, he caught the scent of something familiar: burnt cedar and damp clay. Someone had started mimicking his fire structure. He looked up and saw the avian girl, now crouched beside a smaller pit she had dug with her talons. Her posture was awkward, her motions unsure, but she followed the same principles. Twin holes, airflow tunnel, damp layering. She glanced toward him once, as if asking without words for confirmation. He nodded slowly. She turned back to her work with more confidence. Another cadet joined her, this one amphibious, still trembling, but trying to gather materials. The effort wasn't perfect, but it was something else entirely. It was adoption. He understood in that moment that the fire pit was no longer just a technique. It had become a blueprint, a new symbol within a system that had relied too long on control and machinery. The cadets weren't imitating a survivalist out of desperation. They were learning from something they had never been taught: self-sufficiency without digital dependencies. By the time dusk began to fall, 3 more cadets had built their own pits. Small ones, uneven, some with too much airflow, some not enough. But they were trying. The clearing glowed now with a soft constellation of low, smokeless fires, each one pulsing with the quiet hum of life preserved. When the central tower finally reactivated, the floodlights remained off. Only a transmission line appeared on the portable interface near the group. Simulation concluded. All remaining cadets cleared for decontamination. Transport arrives in 1 hour and 20 minutes. No announcement, no medals, no praise, just a sterile message, a sign that the system would continue. Alex looked at the text, then at the faces of the cadets seated across from him. The fire's warmth reflected in their eyes, and in those reflections, he didn't see soldiers or rivals anymore. He saw something more enduring: recognition. He sat back down and finished grinding the root paste. When it was soft enough, he molded it into palm-sized portions, placed them on a flat stone, and used the pit's heat to slowly dry them. It would take time, but there was no need to rush now. The pit was burning well, and for the first time on Elveron 6, no one screamed. The transport vessel descended without ceremony. Its landing thrusters stirred dry soil into low spirals, brushing against the remnants of ash scattered between the hand-built fire pits. Alex stood near the edge of the clearing, his arms crossed, the sleeves of his jacket still stained with clay and soot. The pit he had built continued to smolder softly behind him, a quiet monument to everything that had happened within the past several hours. As the vessel's hatch opened and the sterilized boarding ramp extended, none of the cadets moved immediately. The avian girl was the first to rise. She folded her wings neatly, eyes lingering on the pit before she stepped forward. Then came the silicon-skinned cadet, still unsteady but upright. The others followed in pairs or alone, their pace unhurried, as if no one wanted to leave until the fire's warmth had fully seeped into their bones. Alex waited until the last cadet had passed him before he walked up the ramp and entered the ship. Inside, the atmosphere was crisp and sterile. Medical officers stood ready near triage pods, their instruments clicking and pulsing with muted efficiency. As each cadet passed, he or she was scanned, injected with stabilizers, and guided to a cushioned bench. Alex was last in line. One officer paused when scanning his palms, where the burns had begun to crack beneath the dirt. The officer extended a regenerative salve, but Alex declined. He wrapped his hands in cloth and moved to the rear of the vessel without a word. The return journey to the upper base was conducted in silence. No one spoke. There were no animated conversations, no triumphant gestures, no analysis of tactics. The mood was reflective. Outside the vessel's windows, the jungle receded beneath layers of mist and shadow. Somewhere below, the clearing still held the blackened marks of chaos and the faint glow of a handmade fire. When the vessel docked, the cadets were directed into the debriefing chamber. It was a hollow domed hall with no chairs, only a polished obsidian floor and a ceiling that projected memories from the previous event in ghostly, translucent waves. The Vehlari instructor appeared at the far end of the chamber. His robe no longer shimmered but hung heavy and matte, as if bearing the weight of what had occurred. Today's drill evolved beyond intended parameters, he began, his voice layered in multiple frequencies, each cadet hearing his or her native cadence. An anomaly in containment protocols led to real fire. There were no fatal losses. There were no external interventions. The instructor raised one limb and a projection unfurled across the ceiling, a view from above, showing cadets fleeing in panic, choking, stumbling. The image shifted to Alex, crouched over his twin pits, shaping airflow with deliberate movements. It was not a dramatic image. No flames burst into the sky. No explosions cracked through the jungle. Just a quiet human digging with his hands while others screamed. This, the instructor said, pausing, is the only structure that preserved heat without triggering reactive suffocation among multi-breathing species. It was neither programmed nor approved. It was instinctual. It was effective. No one spoke. The projection changed again, this time showing the other cadets mimicking the pit structure, slowly, clumsily, but successfully. Then it flickered to the moment when the group sat around the fire. no longer frantic but grounded. There are lessons here, the Valari continued, not in the technology used, but in the thought behind it. Fire without smoke, warmth without harm, unity without command. He turned toward Alex. Human, step forward. Alex did. You were the only species present without integrated environmental logic systems. You relied on sensory data, tactile labor, and pre-digital techniques. Do you believe this makes you superior? No, Alex answered. It just makes me practiced. A ripple moved through the room. Not laughter, not approval, just quiet acknowledgement. The instructor gestured once more. A small module detached from the wall and hovered toward Alex. It bore a glowing sigil, the mark of the Xenorian Emergency Corps. A rare honor usually awarded only to those who introduced new protocols or saved cadets during real disaster events. This symbol will be appended to your training record, the instructor said, and the design of your fire structure will be added to the survival curriculum as Procedure M4, Human Ground Fire Isolation Technique. Alex took the sigil and nodded. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. As the cadets filed out of the hall, some offered glances that lingered longer than before. The avian girl passed him and, without speaking, tapped her talon gently to her chest before extending it slightly forward, a respectful gesture among her kind. He returned the nod, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment. Outside the chamber, the world resumed its mechanical rhythm. Drones hummed. Lights blinked in calculated pulses. But something had shifted, something not easily seen in a debriefing log or captured in a sensor array. Later that evening, Alex walked alone to the observation deck. From this high vantage point, he could see the jungle stretching toward the horizon. The heat of the day long faded. In the distance, tiny flickers appeared between the trees, not from the base, but from the cadets' own field practice zones. Low, controlled, and smokeless. Some were uneven, some flickered too fast, but they were real. As he watched, one fire went out and flared again, then burned steady. Someone had fixed it. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the thin, dry air. The pain in his hands throbbed faintly beneath the cloth wraps. But it was the good kind of pain, the kind that marked real effort, not simulated challenge. He had come to the training as the outsider, the unenhanced, the one expected to observe and fail. But in the moment when control systems collapsed and protocols fell silent, it had been human simplicity, layered in patience, shaped by scars that had held the line. Alex opened his eyes and stepped back from the railing. He didn't need to see more. The jungle would go on. The drills would continue. But something ancient had been reintroduced into the galactic curriculum. The value of the hands, the fire in the soil, and the quiet mind that watched the wind. And somewhere far below, in the dark, a dozen smokeless fires still glowed. Not because they had to, but because someone had shown that they could.